Hey everybody, today is Monday, June 10th, 2024. Coming up on the show today, from the Netflix docuseries Beckham, editor Michael Harte.
I fell in love with the project, and when that happens, you do always give the extra work that you think it needs, and it doesn't become work in the end. It's a lot of effort, but it's not work. What you realise when you have a documentary with a celebrity, there's two ways you can go. You can tell the story that everyone knows, the story that the public already knew or seen on TV, and that can work. But actually, your secret weapon on these films is to subvert what the audience think they know. Like to take what they know and change and flip it on its head. It's my favourite conversation in the edit with the director when I ask them, and they all have the same reaction.
You want to know what that question is? Well, stick around and find out on this edition of The Rough Cut. Oh, it is so nice to be back. Good to see everybody again. I hope you enjoyed our little time off last week. I don't know about you, but I needed another week just to come down from baby reindeer. That was intense. And Peter was a great interview. And wouldn't you just know it, this week we have another great interview with a European editor. I don't know, does Ireland count as European? I mean, I know it does, but somehow it always feels like an entity unto itself. No matter. What does matter is that today we are talking about Beckham, a 4-part documentary series directed by Fisher Stevens, currently streaming on Netflix. There's another common thread to Baby Reindeer. Netflix, that is, not Fisher Stevens. But that's where the similarities end. Beckham, as the title not so subtly implies, is about none other than soccer/football legend David Beckham, a man whose stardom transcended football. And that is why it's okay if you're not familiar with Manchester United, David's first football club, or Sir Alex Ferguson, David's manager for Manchester United. It might not hurt if you're familiar with the Spice Girls, and you probably are. The point is, this is a very enjoyable and interesting series, even if your knowledge of soccer or football is almost entirely informed by watching Ted Lasso. This is thanks, in no small part, to the talents of our guest today, editor Michael Harte. Let me tell you a little bit about Michael Harte. I'm a big Michael Harte fan. And why not? David Beckham can have fans, why can't editors? And I have been a fan of Michael since seeing his work on the documentary 3 Identical Strangers. That film was astounding. I won't get into what it was about right now, but my jaw dropped so much watching that film you could have jammed a soccer ball into my mouth. Which at some point I am sure someone will try doing. But just an amazing story. I highly recommend checking it out. So at that point, Michael's on everyone's radar as an editor to watch. And I am sure that's what director Davis Guggenheim thought when it came time to find an editor for his film, Still, a Michael J. Fox movie. And just like 3 Identical Strangers, I highly recommend watching Still. Fascinating stuff. I wish I had the chance to interview Michael about that one. Well, it's not quite true. I had chances. I even asked Michael about it once, but he was just too busy. That is why there was no way I was going to miss the chance to talk to him about Beckham. And I am very glad I didn't. Miss him, that is. So much fun talking to him. He was on Martha's Vineyard, not too far away from me, working on yet another project when we caught up. He was nice enough to get up extra early to squeeze in some time to talk with us before he started the day's work. He's a good guy like that. So we will get to hearing all that Michael Harte has to say about cutting Beckham, but first I'm going to tell you about someone I know Michael is familiar with, and that's Extreme Music. You see, Extreme Music is a production audio company. I think the very best production audio company. But they have a sister company called Bleeding Fingers. You might remember when Hans Zimmer was on the show the first time, we talked about Bleeding Fingers a little. It is a crew of incredibly talented composers banded together to compose original music for film and TV projects. Beckham happens to be one of those projects. And if you're wondering what's the difference between Extreme Music and their top-shelf production audio tracks and something like Bleeding Fingers and their roster of amazing composers, well, think of it like this. It's like going to a bakery. And with Extreme Music, they have shelves upon shelves of wonderful delicacies already prepared for you to choose from. And with Bleeding Fingers, you just go in there and tell the bakers about the party you're having and what kind of cake you want them to make. Although with their fingers bleeding, I don't think you want them making a cake. That was a shitty analogy, never mind. You're smarter than me, you get the point. But when you need amazing audio tracks to help your next film or TV show, you just go to extrememusic.com and search for just what you need using keywords like tempo, genre, composer, lyrics. They have so much great music, it'll almost feel like they did just make it for you. Especially if you try their reference track feature where you share a track with them and they find you once just like it. So when you're ready to get serious about giving your story the very best in production audio, have yourself a lot of fun and visit extrememusic.com. Finally, at long last, a chance to catch up with someone who's been on my list for a while. Without further ado, here's Ireland's favorite son, Beckham editor Michael Harte. Now we're just a couple of boxes.
I'm S for some reason. I'm just S.
Yeah, you're S.
Yeah. I've hit the jackpot. I've peaked in my career when I get the S treatment from Matt Fury.
This is the big time, baby. You know, one of my favorite things about this series is that your name is the first credit that comes up on, I think, at least the first 3 episodes. Before Fisher's, before anyone else, it's editor Michael Harte, and I don't recall ever seeing that before. How did that come to pass?
I think I put it there when we were doing the rough cut. I don't know, actually. I always think on Netflix it goes the other way. So when the director comes last, and normally they don't really say a film by, but Fisher was really kind, and John Batzik, our producer, when the project was finished, and Nicola Howson as well. Those were the 3 main producers on the project, and I worked kind of relentlessly for a year. And in the middle of it, I actually had a baby, and I didn't have the baby, but my partner had a baby, and so I fell in love with the project, and when that happens, you do always give the extra work that you think it needs, and it doesn't become work in the end. You just it's a lot of effort, but it's not work, and I think sometimes in a project that shows, and the people around you kind of really appreciate it, and other times some people don't, and they go, oh, thank you, and I think you get paid, and they were doing me a favor to let me work on their project, but that rarely happens. I've been pretty lucky, and but in this case, they wanted that. They said, look, we think you should have it, and I was really appreciative for it, and if weirdly it's friends of mine say it to me, and I didn't think people would notice except a couple of industry people, but it's nice to get a little recognition. We editors spend a lot of time in dark rooms, and to get recognition in any way is always lovely.
Well, first of all, I've seen 3 of your films, and your effort and your love for them came through in all of them.
Oh, thanks.
And second, the editor's name should absolutely go earlier. So maybe that's been the secret. Just editors, you just got to put your name first and see if anybody notices, man.
Exactly. We don't want to have an awkward conversation in the edit then about taking the name out, I think. But no, it's good. It's good. I don't know. And actually, on a couple of other projects, the discussion, because I also think sometimes, I like to work. I like to do everything to a fault, to be honest, in the edit. I kind of even struggle to hand over workloads to assistant editors. It's just my nature, and I'm a bit like David Beckham with his kind of clothes in his house, and he likes to keep everything in order, and I have kind of similarities to that in my work, where I become obsessive about the material, and I think people spot it. Halfway through the project, they need to rein me in sometimes, because what I like to do is watch everything and interrogate every single possibility that the film can be. But you just don't always have the time to do it. But I do like to go the extra yard to push it as far as I can. And on other projects, I've had a couple of similar things. David Guggenheim gave me the second credit at the end of Still, and I didn't ask for it, but it's really nice. And you know what? The truth is, a lot of editors, there's not just me, but a lot of editors deserve it, because especially in documentary, we're now living in a time and working in a time where a lot of material was shot because of the transition into digital cameras, and there's so much material that was shot in the 80s, especially the 90s and the 90s. And what's starting to happen is that period we're looking back on now. There's a lot of retrospective documentaries about the 90s and the 90s, and Beckham is one of them, where you just have endless amounts of material. And so the pressure and the workload on editors is far greater than it's ever been. We get drives, and it's just like, here's hundreds of thousands of hours of material, and that's not an exaggeration. When you have to select and work, I said, with your assistant editors, and I think You know, I always hear the thing about unsung heroes and that stuff. I'm not calling the editors unsung heroes and stuff, but we do a lot of work that may not necessarily show on screen. And I think a lot of producers and a lot of directors are starting to kind of understand that, and it's reflective. And you'll see a lot of, actually, you'll see a lot of editors' names as producers in documentaries now as well. And it's great to see. It really is. And, you know, I actually find that recognition more satisfying than kind of the awards even. I think when your team, when you're at the end of a project, you know, some projects at the end of the project, nobody wants to speak to each other. But when it works out and you get the recognition as an editor, and not just a pair of hands, you know, somebody who's just pressing buttons, because it's just not that. And I think people are starting to become aware of it. And it's actually, and you know, I think when projects are greenlit, one of the first questions I think they start to ask is, well, who's cutting this? Like, who have you got to edit it? And it's not no longer post-production anymore. It's not after the fact. It's like they're trying to bring editors on earlier into the project and be more creative with them and not just kind of, you know, it's not finishing anymore. It's actually kind of, it's a highly creative job now because it has to be, because there's so much material. And it's great in one sense, but it's actually really hard work in the other. But
yeah. The project you did prior to Beckham, kind of, you just mentioned this, was, or at least it was released prior to Beckham, I should say, was the Michael J. Fox documentary Still.
Yeah.
So Beckham would not be your first crack at doing a doc about a world famous celebrity. Maybe that played into you being the editor for Beckham. Maybe it didn't. Either way, tell me about getting this gig and your first discussions with Fisher Stevens.
It's a good question. Actually, I got a call. I was on my way to the airport, or it was 2 days. I was 2 days before I was going to go to LA to go in the edit with Davis Guggenheim. And I get a call, and I'd never spoken to Fisher before. And he rang and he said, look, I've got this project. It's about David Beckham. He said he loved Don't Fuck With Cats, and he wanted me to cut it. And I was like, I'm booked. I'm literally 2 days away from starting the Michael J. Fox documentary. And then I had a problem with my visa. So I rang Fisher back and said, actually, I might be able to do it. There's an issue with my visa. I may not get to America, and there may be problems. And then I rang him the next day and said, no, the visa's been sorted. And he kind of, I think he was more disgusted that I gave him any hope. But so I went and worked on Still for a year with Davis and Michael J. Fox, and it was an amazing experience. And I didn't speak to Fisher. And then at the end of Still, I said to my family, okay, I'll take a nice break now, and we'll go on holidays. And I took like 2 or 3 weeks. And then I got a call from John Batzik, and he said, are you available? We're still in the edit with Beckham, or we're kind of still figuring it out. They've done a lot of shooting, and I think they may have started the edit a touch too early. This kind of, I'm contradicting what I was saying at the start of the show, but they hadn't actually shot a lot of the interviews for Beckham yet, and they were in the process of shooting them, but they needed an editor to come on board at that point to kind of potentially take all the episodes and look at them as a whole and think, where is this film going to go? And I said no. I was like, I'm exhausted. I've done a celebrity documentary, and not necessarily. I hate even saying the word celebrity documentary because it kind of reduces it into that. And Michael J. Fox definitely wasn't just that. It was, but I felt with Beckham, I was worried it was going to be a similar film, and then as always, what happens is I kind of took a couple of days, and I ended up like the worst thing you can do when you're on holidays. You start looking at clips that they send you, and you start going on YouTube and looking at a couple of Beckham's goals. And I got sucked into it. And Fisher sent me a few bits of archive from Beckham's childhood, and I was just in. And he sent a clip. The key was he sent a clip that was about 10 minutes long, and it was some of the interviews with David and some of Gary Neville, and I watched it with my partner Claire on the couch at home, and I put it on the laptop and we started watching it, and I never forgot when Victoria Beckham showed up Claire just sat up in her chair and I could see her leaning in, and I tried to say something, and she told me to shut up because she was listening to Victoria, and I knew, I was like, this could be really special. There's something about this story that I completely underestimated, and I wasn't a Manchester United fan, I was a Liverpool fan, so I paid more attention to Liverpool when I was growing up, and Manchester United were almost the enemy. But watching David and watching Victoria in interviews and seeing the archive of them when they were younger, I was just hooked. And then John rang one more time to see what I was thinking. I said, you know what, let's do it. And I thought the edit was only going to be for a month or 2 months, and it ended up becoming for a year.
You very rightly brought up that the Michael J. Fox doc, it's very reductive just to say it's about a celebrity. It's so much more than that in his case. Same thing here with David and I guess also Victoria Beckham. What did you and Fisher want to tell the world about them that they didn't probably already know?
You know, it's something I thought when we were cutting still, and it carried across into Beckham, is what you realize when you have a story, a documentary with a celebrity. There's two ways you can go. You can tell the story that everyone knows, and that's easy because there's so much material there, and you actually don't need to interview them that much because you can lean into the story that the public already knew or seen on TV, and that can work. But actually, your secret weapon on these films is to subvert what the audience think they know, like to take what they know and change and flip it on its head. And everybody knew the story of David's football, especially in England. I think everybody knew the story of his football career, that he's a footballer and who married a pop star. And it's the most famous man in the world, one of the most famous people in the world, marrying one of the most famous people in the world. And for me as an audience, I kind of thought I knew the story. But what you realize is that, especially the first cut that I watched, it was about football. We were using David. The first cut was using David to kind of understand football and understand Manchester United. And it was a kind of interesting documentary if you like football. But again, to my partner, she's not going to watch that. And I knew there was something else. The two things that came out, we went back to scratch when I joined the project. I said, I just need to watch all the interviews. I need to watch everything. Because I knew there was a lot more gold there than just a football documentary. And Fisher was always very keen to make it bigger than that. What you realised it was about, the two things, it was about family. It was about his relationship with his family and his relationship with Alex Ferguson as a father figure, his relationship with his parents, but also his relationship with Victoria, who became his family. And that was the prism that the film needed to be seen through. People don't know that story that well. They know they were together, but they don't know the details of their relationship. And so instead of using David as a way into football, as a way into Manchester United, what you're doing is you're using the football as a way into David and Victoria. And Fisher was kind of strong in that. He said this needs to be more than football, it needs to be about family. But the more, and especially in episode 1, I think the really kind of exciting thing for me, and we kind of only figured it out after a couple of weeks in the edit, was you had this tension in his life whereby Alex Ferguson, who, like I said, was one of his father figures, kind of didn't believe in individuality within the team. It was like, they could express themselves definitely, but it was about being a team player and wearing the same coloured boots. And he's highly, highly successful for that. And Beckham was part of that squad, which is, there's no wine team, be part of the squad and we will get places. Then when he meets Victoria and the Spice Girls, it's the difference between Manchester United and the Spice Girls is the Spice Girls mantra basically was express yourself, be an individual. Don't conform. And they all wear different clothes. Each of the characters, each of those, the singers and the Spice Girls all wore different clothes. They all had different names. It was Sporty Spice and Posh Spice. And so they're the complete opposite of Alex Ferguson. And so David is in the middle of this when he's like 21, 22, and he falls in love with both. He falls in love with Alex Ferguson and he falls in love with Victoria. And when we figured that one out, and it was all happening at the same time, around 96, 97, 98, that was the kind of tension, especially in the first one, that I thought we can have a lot of fun with this. The back and forth between those two worlds, between his life with Victoria and his life with Alex Ferguson, and how he can negotiate that was kind of fascinating. And that I never knew. I never looked. The truth is, I never looked closely enough at the Spice Girls or Manchester United to see that. And I don't think I don't necessarily think a lot of people did. They just saw them as two separate entities that weren't necessarily related to each other.
Who knew there was a love triangle hidden in there?
I know. And is there anything better than a love triangle in a documentary? And so that, the more we could lean into shots where David is on the pitch and looking at the sideline, and is he looking at Alex Ferguson? Is he looking at Victoria? And sometimes he waves at her in the crowd, and it's perfect drama, and it's fun to play with, and it's kind of fascinating,
Yeah, absolutely. The movie prior to this that we've talked about, Still, a Michael J. Fox movie, that's a movie. The film Three Identical Strangers, the one that introduced you to the world or the world to you, those are movies.
Yes.
Beckham is a series broken up into 4 episodes. How is it different doing an episodic docuseries versus doing a documentary movie? Or is there any sort of appreciable difference to how you approach it?
No, there is. I mean, there's actually a little more structure, weirdly, when it comes to series, because you have to stick in and around the hour mark, especially on Netflix. I wanted to bring it down even tighter each episode, but Fisher was very sure that it needed to be the length it just needed to be. He was like, don't think of the time, it'll work itself out. The audience will go with it, and he's right. When you do a movie, like you said, or you do a feature doc, there's way more freedom, how long it needs to be, and you have less structure to play with, or to kind of lean into. On series, you're kind of hitting the end of episodes. They need to be cliffhangers, and it sounds limiting. It sounds like, oh, okay, you're just kind of ticking boxes here. But actually what happens is things start to get sharper and things become more interesting because you're paying way more attention to the structure. But Fisher's big note throughout the edit, he kept saying, don't think of this like a series. You need to think of this like a 4.5 hour, 5 hour, 6 hour movie. He said, I promise you, if you do that, we'll find the points where we need to break up the episodes. He said, just think, he was like, think of this like a sweeping massive movie, and it takes place over the course of 30 years, and if you lean into that, you'll see the points where we just need to break up the episodes, and luckily we did. I cut chronologically, so I like to watch everything, like I said, to a fault, and I like to see all the archive, and it's much harder in something like this because you've got the most photographed man in the world who marries the most photographed woman in the world at the time, and the archive is endless. But also they shot, I think, nearly 60 or 70 interviews. So I like to watch everything, and then what I like to do is decide in my head, okay, where's the start of this? Where do we begin? And I cut from there, not fine cut, but pretty close to it. And I'm happy to throw all that stuff out and recut it again and again and again. But I like to kind of figure out where the start is and cut as if I'm watching it. I don't like to do loose cuts and show big chunks of things to people for 4, 5, 6 hours, and I get bored. In this case, as we were cutting it chronologically, actually Fisher was always a step ahead of me. He was shooting the interviews for episodes 2 and 3 and 4. He was always trying to stay ahead. And so as I was cutting it, I remember when he got sent off against Argentina at the end of the first episode, I remember it just felt right. You could feel it. Fisher was right. We didn't plan it in advance, but when I got to that point, I think it was like an hour and 10 minutes into the first episode, it felt like this is a good place to take a break and take stock. Plus also, each episode has to have its own theme. I think it's really important to do that. So each episode has to have its own individual start, middle, and end and thematic arc. And each of them do. And in episode 1, particularly, I said it was all about the individual versus the team and how he navigates that. And in episode 2 was very much about abuse from the crowd and hate. It was a film about hate and how he could turn the hate and the vitriol that he was experiencing into something positive, which is what he did. And I think that the trick is, get organized, know your material inside out, start cutting and trust yourself that you'll find the end of the episode as you're cutting it. But that's just my way of working,
You use the word cliffhanger, talking about ending the episodes on a cliffhanger. I literally have a note saying the episodes end on a cliffhanger, and then I wrote, don't say cliffhanger. That's probably not the right word to use, but I guess it is. But what was interesting about the way you approached it is, let's say the episodes end on a cliffhanger,
yeah.
But it felt like in the next episode, you didn't immediately pick up where that left off. You did sort of a reset at the beginning of the episode, focusing on something else for a few minutes before getting back to that cliffhanger or turning point that closed the previous episode. Why did you do it that way? Or were you even conscious that you were doing it that way?
You're right, actually. It's the scenes, the verite scenes before we launch into the story. I think the first cuts that we had didn't have those because I was trying to just nail the plot of the past, the retrospective story. And episode 1 started when he scored the goal from the halfway line. Episode 2 started after he got sent off, and the media and the fans come after him. But Fisher has this great sense of he has an amazing way of kind of hanging out with these people, and they're very, very comfortable with him. In the interviews, he could make them quite uncomfortable. He was asking very uncomfortable questions, but there's also a sense he's, as a director, what he's great at is you feel like you're hanging out with these people when Fisher's directing these scenes. It just all seems very loose. And as I was cutting the retrospective, the past narrative, the doc of David's story, when he was shooting the interviews, he was also just randomly getting these moments with David in his house, looking around, going through his closets and his kitchen and his garden, and you get, it looked great, and David always looks great. But actually what you started to realize when you watched them, there was something about his character in those moments that set the tone for the next episode when we started to play around with them. So the episode where he's in his kitchen talking about clipping the candle wicks and cleaning and has to keep this house clean. And the key line from Fisher in there is that he said, you just seem to think you want everything to be perfect. And then you get a guy who is on a relentless drive for things to be perfect. And so in episode 2, when we put that at the start of the film, when things fall apart and things are far from perfect, you really kind of connect to it, because without saying it, you can feel his pain. You can feel a guy whose life is basically spinning out of control. And it just helped give us more character to David, because his story is so relentless and it's so fast, and you go through it, there's not that much time for reflection, as he didn't have in his life. But today, we can, when you see him walking around his house and making his wardrobes perfect, you get a sense of his character today, but it also then it helps you kind of relate to him when he's younger, and without having to slow it down too much, Those moments were great. Any of the moments with him today were really kind of honest and kind of revealing, and more than ever, the one where him and Victoria, I know it's not at the start of the episode, where him and Victoria have that famous scene about being honest. It's like when he grills her. I think it's the most honest scene in the film, because you get to see a couple in all their glory in their own house. When you call over to someone's house for dinner and they invite you in, and after an hour at the dinner table, you start to really see who they are, because they start to kind of talk like that. And it felt really, those moments just illuminated David to the audience, which is great.
As you said, Fisher is present in the series. You hear his voice interacting with David and Victoria, but you don't really see him. And I find that in documentaries with the director, there's sort of this spectrum that goes from Michael Moore to Ken Burns, where on the Michael Moore side, the director very much carries the narrative. The director is, quote unquote, the star of the movie, whereas on the Ken Burns side, the director's fingerprints stylistically are very much present, but you have no trace of the director. Here, Fisher is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
You mentioned that he had a great way of making them relaxed and then at times making them uncomfortable, which worked well too. But was there an actual discussion between you and Fisher about how much to incorporate him into the film or into the series or not?
It's my favorite conversation in the edit with the director. When I ask them, and they all have the same reaction. When I ask them, would they consider their voice or even their picture to be in the documentary, they all have the same expression, and they all say no initially. But the expression is always maybe, I don't know. And no one is afraid to put themselves on camera. And in this case, I actually said to Fisher, just let me play with the material first on my own and see where I go. And we didn't have that conversation too deeply. It was quick. And like I said, he gave me the kind of, no, I don't want to be in it, but I can see in his face he potentially might. But it was quick conversation. And look, I like to just use anything I can to get it right. And if it's the director's voice, so be it. And if not, it doesn't need it. I'll fight that battle. When it really was effective was when David starts to open up about the pain that he went through in 1998 or after 1998, after he got sent off. It was effective for some punchlines and to kind of go the back and forth between him and other interviews. I kind of love Fisher's voice as well. I kind of think it works really well.
Yeah.
But where I realized we definitely needed it was when David started to open up to him, because David was opening up for the first time. A lot of things he was telling us, he was opening up. about what he went through. And a lot of people didn't know that story, didn't know what he went. They knew what he went through, but they didn't know how he felt or how he reacted or what he was doing when the media kind of came after him, and when we all came after him as fans. And although I'm an Irish fan, so. But I felt it was important to have Fisher's voice because it was almost, I'm not saying Fisher is a therapist, but it felt like David was going through a therapeutic process. And the back and forth really helped that. When I was listening to it in the edit, it felt like it was the first time David was telling someone. And when I took Fisher's voice out, it didn't. It felt like he was telling it as if he was telling it again and again. There was just something about how unnatural it felt. And maybe it was to do with his answers. And when Fisher would ask them, Fisher didn't know this either. What's great about Fisher too is that he would go into a lot of interviews without knowing stuff and learning for the first time, which I think really helps in this, because they'll engage with him because they know he's hearing it for the first time or they'll feel it. And so Fisher's voice really felt like it helped show how David was going through this for the first time, and it felt therapeutic. And David's spoken about it, he said that is the case. And plus Fisher's kind of funny too, so it's nice to hear his voice. he's such a funny character.
He is. I want to go back to Still a few more times. Mm-hmm. The first question on Still I wanted to ask was, Michael J. Fox worked with you on the project. How involved was David in post-production of Beckham?
Actually, not much, to be honest. Michael J. Fox watched a couple of cuts pretty much near the end of the project and basically had no notes. But his note was, don't listen to me. Do the film that you want to make. Otherwise, what's the point? That was kind of mind-blowing. And I thought he was going to... He's worked with Steven Spielberg. He's worked on huge films and Robert Zemeckis. And I thought Michael J. Fox would come in and say, here's what you need to do to make this even better. But he was like, he trusted Davis so much. And so he kind of weighed in a bit. David was the same. David didn't... It was near the end of the project when we showed him the cut for the first time as a kind of courtesy and said, look, this is where we're going and this is what we're making and it's pretty close to finished and what do you think? And his main notes were, consider this match. I remember I played that in between those, and it was football. It was football detail that I may have missed, or I made a mistake on, and he was really good on that. He seems to remember everything about football. But on the whole, they were so hands off, which I was really surprised. But it was just great because it helped us kind of make the film we wanted to make. And I think David's smart, as you can see with Miami, and he bought this club and saw it a mile off. He knew what it was going to be, and to get Messi to come there now, he has a really good sense, as he was in the 90s as well, with fashion and branding and how a footballer can be. He could see very much into the future and what it could be. And I'd like to think, and maybe I'm giving myself and the film crew way more credit, I'd like to think that he saw what we were cutting and said, I need to leave these guys alone because I think this could be really big. We didn't know. I didn't think it would be as big as it would be. But I think he watched it and thought, he trusted us and said, just keep going. And I think we showed him the first 3 episodes and we had the 4th one to go. But it's really nice when that happens, because it can very much go the other way. And that's not a nice place to be.
Was there anything that you learned working on Still that you were able to use while you were working on Beckham?
Very good question. I've really in the last few year,s I think, kind of fallen in love with archive and the use of archive in documentaries and what we did on Still, which was really play with the archive instead of using it as just pictures to cover cuts in interviews, which is, I think, the worst thing you can do, which I was guilty of for a long time. And you find the shots that illustrate what they're saying in an interview. I always say it's like almost like killing one bird with 2 stones. You're doing the same thing twice, and it's just a total waste of time. And what Davis really pushed me on Still, which is like, always think of the archive in a different way. Use it in this, like, if you're going to use it, you got to use it in a clever way. Otherwise, it's just kind of boring. And if they're talking about something, use something completely different in archive and get those 2 things to talk to each other, and it'll become more special, and it won't become ordinary. And it was the same on Beckham, where we had so much archive of him being interviewed back in the day, and And sometimes we would use archive that was kind of contradictory to what someone else was saying, and just to play around with it. Instead of him saying, I scored a goal against Liverpool, and then you see the goal against Liverpool, it was like, I was on the phone to Victoria at 3 o'clock in the morning, and his mum says, I think he was overly tired. Then you show the match from, you show the goal that he scored against Liverpool, or the goal that he doesn't score, or the corner that he takes that isn't, and then it becomes more interesting. You start to use it, and you start to think of it not in a literal sense, but in a very, very creative sense. And still, when I worked on still, that's what I really learned on it, is just always kind of interrogate and question the archive that you're using, and that it's not covering edits, like I said.
To be able to do what you just talked about, you have to be so on top of the organization of the material to be able to stitch something like that together. There were a few of these that jumped out at me. Like there's a scene where David is running on the pitch in the rain as a kid, and then you match cut to him running on the pitch in the rain for Manchester United.
Nice. I'm glad you remembered that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, because I was just like, oh, look, nice work there, Michael. Or like you have his, he opens up his messy closet as a kid, or we don't ever actually get to see it. He says, oh, it's so messy. And then match cut to him opening up his closet as a grown-up. It's immaculate. It's got 100 suits. And so just being able to do something like that, so much of the work has to go in up front in terms of how you organize and make note of where everything is. How do you even begin to do that, and how do you do that?
Couldn't agree more. I think, and I say it to assistant editors a lot, because they get bored with my process because there's no cutting for the longest time. I say the battle is won or lost before you lay a finger in the edit, before you make any creative decisions. You have to get organized with your material more than ever in documentary, like we talked about before, because there's so much material. I say there's so much material, but there's so much potential there. And you've got to watch everything. Otherwise, what are we doing? Why would we get into docs if you just, you don't want to see all the possibilities? Again, within reason, but at the start of every project, I kind of beg the producers more. It's always the producers you've got to ask them more than the directors, because they're pressing the buttons. But I always beg and say, look, I promise you, if you give me time, I won't have a cut for you soon. But once I get that first cut to you, you're going to get a lot. You'll see a lot. And if you just have patience with me, when you get the first cut, you give me your notes, I'll give you the second one very quickly, because the first, maybe third, if not half of a project for me is watching and organizing the material. And I mean organizing it to an inch of its life. For example, when I started and I said, I think I want to see every match that he's played from 1996, first season, whatever season he scored the halfway line goal. I said, I want to see every match. So somebody helped me, and every time he touched the ball, we'd have a marker. We'd mark it in the Avid. Whoever they interviewed, Gary Neville, every time you see Gary Neville, I want to see his face. Alex Ferguson, when Victoria comes to the match, you see her. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, who also showed, everybody, Simeone. I need to see it all, and it takes time, and it's long, and you can get bored. The trick is to take a lot of breaks, but I've become literally obsessive. I don't take any notes either. All this has to be in my Avid, because I want then to, when I want to find something, I don't think I have a photographic memory, but I have a good memory to remember a lot of material on any given project. And so when I think of something that I want to do, to change something in a cut, if I've organized myself well enough, forgive me if this sounds boring, because I'm really going into organizational skills, but when I want to make a change, I want to feel like I can do that in minutes, as opposed to having to go back to the material, ringing a story, a producer, and saying, do you know where that is? And it becomes this big kind of task. I want to feel like I can do it myself in minutes. And on Beckham, I think it was 2 months. I was like, I need 2 months just to go through this material alone. And I can watch stuff at triple speed as well. If needs be in the matches, I can watch stuff. But I have an ability to just get organized. And if I want to search for something, I just press 2 buttons and I can find it. And so it sounds so boring, but it unlocks the creativity massively if you're organized and if you get your SHIT together right at the start of the project. The problem is there's always pressure from production companies and from broadcasters to the streamers. They want to see stuff early. if you fight that battle early and say, I'm able to now a bit because I have a couple of credits under my belt, but it's the number one thing for me is like just hold off and showing anything too soon until you're organized, because if you do that, when it comes to cutting, you're totally free, and you know where everything is, and you don't fear it, and it just becomes it's a bit like cooking. Like it's like you get all your ingredients on there before you do anything, before you cook anything, and once you do that, it's great. And then and it was the same on Still. I mean, Still was a completely different beast because it was movies and stuff. But organization for me is everything. Actually, funnily, I just remember something. When I got to the end of going through all the archival, which took 2 months, and I went through all the interviews as well. The last interview I watched was David's dad. And at the very end of that interview, after watching 60 interviews, he says to Fisher, "Oh, by the way, I've got 1,300 hours of tapes of archive if you need them to." And I was like, "No, we're not. We cannot go through that stuff." I was like, I thought I'd reached the top of Everest. And then it was like, right, you need to go to the moon. And that was a nightmare, but we selected from that.
As you said, because of who you were covering and the people you were covering, there was so much archival material available to you. Just the problem being, how do I get through it all? For a lot of documentaries that aren't capturing the subject or the story in the moment, they'll use animation to recreate elements that you just couldn't capture or could never access. David shows an affinity for doing drawings. I think in some documentaries, they might take that and run with it and go, okay, we're going to use that as sort of an interstitial element to stitch things together or to add things that we just couldn't find in the archival.
It's a good question. In terms of anything other than interview and archive, I don't think it was a consideration because the stuff is so strong. And I think usually you do that. Sometimes people do it really for creative reasons and it helps. And sometimes you do it because you don't have anything else. But we had an embarrassment of riches on this. And I think kind of the older I'm getting and the more I work, I'm kind of leaning massively into archive and the real and stuff that's already available to me. And because so much has been shot over the last 20, 30 years, we have more than enough to play with. And when somebody tries to introduce a new element to the edit, so like I freak out. I'm like, no way, it has to be justified. I'm like, sometimes a director may want more control of the creative and the right to do so, and sometimes they're right. But on this, it really felt like we had the elements there, we had the pieces, and we had more than enough material to work through.
So starting a story like this seems relatively straightforward. You're going to start with him as a kid becoming this phenom and being recruited by Manchester United, but then creating the framework on which you could build the rest of the story does seem like a big challenge. Are the building blocks, for lack of a better term, maybe foundation's a better term, the foundation for this series, I would think maybe where you would start is I'm going to take the sound bites, the interviews, build a structure or a radio edit out of that, and then start filling it in with archival.
It's a great question, actually, and what I do is Fisher had shot enough for the first episode and a half. Like that's the time period he'd covered from the goal and the halfway line goal against Wimbledon, all the way up until I think it was when he hit rock bottom with the sending off, and half of the first episode, even though we didn't know it was the half of the second episode. Sorry. I will first watch all the interviews, watch everything and say, get them organized and mark everything and break those up into story beats. And if there's stuff that aren't plot driven, then I'll put that into a different category, which is thematic or emotional insight. That's stuff that isn't necessarily linked to the plot, but more about his character. I'll watch that and I'll do that for a couple of weeks and I'll map it out and then I'll look at the archive after, because I think if you watch the archive first, you can get lost. If you have no context for it, you're kind of just watching stuff. And I think and I've made a mistake in a couple of edits by kind of jumping into the archive and thinking, you know what it's about. Then you watch the interviews and you've got to watch the archive all over again because they're leading it. The characters are leading it. These are the things I've worked on which are kind of interview heavy. And exactly what you said, then I will kind of loosely take a couple of sections that I've watched, put them in the timeline, I'll watch those back again, and I'll grab what archive I want that I think could be related to those sections. And then I'll just start cutting. And I mean, I have such a bad habit that I don't know if it's a bad habit, it seems to have worked, but I start to fine cut. I go in and go watch the first shot and, okay, what happens next? Then what happens? And what does he say there? Because I have a kind of good handle of my material, and then he'll talk about something and I'll say, okay, we've got this archive and maybe we could use that and let that play out a little longer. And I'll recut that stuff over and over and over again. What I like to do, and I think it helps, is I like to nail the opening. I like to get the first 10 minutes right. And I cut it and fine cut it and over again until I feel like this is, and I in the back of my mind thinking I may throw all this out. And it's also great because I get to show something a bit more crafted and people get a bit more excited about that. And but what happens is you're not just trying to crack the story. The hardest thing in a doc, especially like this, is you're trying to crack the tone. How does this feel? Are we leaning into humor more? Or is it dramatic? Is it gripping? And I think you're almost creating like a taster for yourself to sell to yourself to go, this is what this film wants to be, what it could be. And once you crack that, it's the weirdest thing. Everything just starts to flow after that. Things start to fall in place. Stuff then, you've 600-700 hours of interviews and you can see what you need and what you don't need once you get that start right, once you get that good frame right at the start. And it can get you in trouble too if you don't get it right. But it's just the way I work. I just like to, and then I fine cut from then on, and I'll send a cut to Fisher and say, here's a cut, and here's the first cut, and what do you think? And more often than not, then he'll send notes, and I'll get notes from our producers, and some will ignore, and some will take on board, and then I love to get a cut early. I love to get something up and on its feet very early in the process, and people start having conversations and to talk, and then it becomes a collaborative, creative effort. And what's this about? And what's good though with this as well is that it'll start to feed into the interviews they're shooting. So I like to cut before they finish all their interviews, and we have more time then to shoot more interviews. And then I'll send stuff to Fisher, and he'll start getting ideas as to questions that he'll want to ask them. And like I said, that's the kind of joy of bringing an editor onto the project earlier. And it's not post-production. It's almost like pre-production,
Well, one of the early benefits of artificial intelligence, before it wipes out humanity and destroys the world, that is the speed and accuracy with which it can do transcriptions.
Yeah.
And those can play so heavily into working through a lot of footage and documentary. I think you were a little early. You were a little pre the AI transcription revolution. But were you using transcripts within the Avid to try and organize these things, or to have your assistants do rough groupings of material for you?
Yeah, I will get the assistants to do that, to do transcripts of all the interviews, not archive. I think archive is just too much to do, and I think I kind of like watching it. But we'll get transcriptions, and then there's script sync where you can bring it into the Avid, so that if I click on it, it'll bring me right to that point in the interview. But I actually don't like to read transcripts before I watch the interviews. I think there's something important about watching the interviews fresh and connecting with them and looking at them and seeing what they sound like. I think if you do too much on paper, it's great for plot. It really, you kind of nail your plot, and but what happens is then you start to lose there's an emotion to the interviews, and I love watching it as an audience and just paying attention to when I sit up in the edit and when I kind of get interested and when I get bored, and you can't do that on paper. It just doesn't work, reading the transcriptions. And I think it's an editor's obligation to watch it first raw and take your notes through that and organize it yourself by watching it on the screen as opposed to on paper, because we ain't journalists, we're not authors, and we're definitely visual people, and as are the audience. They're not showing up to a library, they're watching this on TV, and I think you have to remember that, and that first instinct is so strong, it's so important when you watch interviews, that very, very first instinct when you watch it. And when I go into an edit, and sometimes people have already paper edited the film based on, they'll shoot the interviews, they'll get the transcripts, they'll give me a cut that's been done on paper. It's just a dangerous game, and I think you just miss a step and you miss a beat, and it's really important to the film. And especially on this one, Beckham, it was like, on paper, what they were saying is okay, but actually it was sometimes a glint in David's eye, or it was the way Victoria delivered it, and on paper that just wouldn't have come across. You just wouldn't have spotted it, and I get sleepless nights thinking about all the material I've missed, and so. Sorry, there's a theme here, which is like my obsession about watching everything, and
best not to think about it.
Which I don't know, is it healthy or not?
I don't know. We'll have to check your closet. You said editors are visual people. That is certainly true, and it reminded me that I was actually somewhat incorrect, which is hardly a rare occurrence. But when I asked you about not having these interstitials, like how sometimes documentaries will do some sort of animation or some sort of visual treatment. You actually kind of do. You have the interview subjects looking directly into camera.
Yes.
And sometimes it's just them just sort of a little smile looking into camera for a while. And sometimes you'll superimpose footage over their faces, sort of almost shaped by their faces. I'd love to hear about how that effect came about.
That was Fisher right at the start when he was shooting the interviews. That's what he did. He said, trying to not do a Fisher accent, but he'd be like, I want to see into their souls, is what he would say.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was in an edit with him for a year, so I can do Hugo Baker if you need to. But he was right. He just wanted to see their souls and to see the reaction on their faces when they saw a goal that they may have scored, especially with David. And I always loved Eric Cantona stuff was excellent when he's staring at the kind of time. And you knew it felt like he hadn't seen it in so long. And, that's an emotion that you just don't get by somebody telling you. Like it's just this kind of nostalgic look on their face, and it's almost reflective of the audience when they're watching the same material. And like, I remember that moment, and look at those guys, and it's so far from when it happened. It was 96 and sometimes 1992, and he didn't do it with everyone. Weirdly, he didn't do it with Gary Neville, but it was just a time thing as well. It was a kind of beautiful shot, and it took a while to set up. Initially, when I saw it, I wasn't sure it was going to work, because I thought, I don't know, are they looking at the screen? Are they looking at us? Or what are they looking at? And we put audio in there initially so you hear the commentary. But what we realised is we had to superimpose the shot on initially in the first couple of sections when they're watching these clips, because we showed it to a few people and they just thought they were just shots of people staring at the screen. They were like, that they were just hero shots. And after a while, they said, I think you've one too many hero shots in there. And I get who that is. You don't need to introduce them again. And when we superimposed the clip onto the shot, which took a while, it really helped. But I think the scene which unlocked the series for us was when we have a montage with David scoring all these amazing goals, and we had Oasis Supersonic on top of it, and it was just a moment, like it was an adrenaline rush. It was like of nostalgia, and you're just going, come with us to the 90s, and here we are. And those shots then within that section really helped, because you could see the characters were on the same journey with you, and you almost connect with them. And Cantona you had, and there was, I'm trying to remember, even just seeing David watching it, it just gave it something different. It just gave it an extra layer that it also allowed me to be more creative with the cutting. But like initially I rejected it, but Fisher was like, yeah, it's their soul, man.
Well, you brought up Oasis. We should talk about the needle drops, which are pretty eclectic. When you're choosing the needle drops, are you thinking about being period correct? Are you thinking about being thematically correct? Or is it just like, hey, this song just feels right for this moment?
It's a bit of both. I think sometimes you can, especially in a series, what I found is when you can do it initially. So we do it with Supersonic, with Oasis, and people love it and they go for it, and it just cuts so nicely with it. And I remember watching The Last Dance, and they did a lot of really, really good needle drops, but I was like, we've got to keep this to Britain. It's got to be in that period in the 90s. But what starts to happen, I think, in a series is if you do it too many times, the audience gets used to it and they get bored of it, and it doesn't have any effect. And you're like, oh, okay, now we're in the noughties, we're going to start hearing noughties music, and they expect it coming. So you have to mix it up. You have to just kind of, again, subvert what the audience to think it's coming, or otherwise they'll just get bored. And one of the big ones was when I think we used Oasis in episode 1, and then actually we used Blur in episode 2. It was a bit more downbeat. It was the inversion of it. But when David scores the goal against Greece, the free kick in episode 3, which was kind of his redemption from England, and I remember thinking, we need to go somewhere else here. It has to be something. It just needs to feel right, and forget about the period, because nothing in the period was working for us. But then we thought, what about Motown, or can we just go somewhere else? And I started thinking about Richard Curtis movies, and which is what the episode 3 starts to feel like at one point. And Fisher was always like that, lean into movie kind of sensibilities, and we did that in episode 2. I remember watching Whiplash again and again, but episode 3 started to feel like, this was about him and her, or a lot more about David and Victoria. You could feel the romance coming out, and the romance with the audience was coming back. So we used "Give Me All Your Lovin'," and there was, you got to try it again and again. You got to try different tracks and stuff, and I like to do it first myself. And when the goal hits the back of the net and the organ started to kick in for that song, it was just like, as someone says, it fits like a glove. The music literally just started to fit like a glove, and that was when we said, right, let's mix it up more. Let's try tracks from anywhere, and just you just got cut with your gut, and whatever feels right, you use, and if it feels right, it's good, and if it doesn't, it ain't. Like, and so, the problem with it is that you get lost then because there's no barrier, there's no structure to what you're trying to do. So you're pulling music from everywhere, and then I'm listening to music in the middle of the night, and when I should be going to sleep and getting rest, and Fisher's doing the same. But actually, weirdly, what happened was we had cut the film for so long, and then I think we couldn't get the rights to Supersonic, and we tried every track under the sun, and it just wasn't working. And I think 3-4 weeks before the film was supposed to be broadcast, we got a call from Netflix and said, you got to make Supersonic work. It's so good. It's the entry point into the series for the audience. And then Adam Dadeo, one of our execs, had kind of mentioned it and said, please try and get it because it's too good. And he was right. And I remember watching it then when we had the premiere thinking he was right. It just worked.
Well, you said a lot of things in our talk today.
Sorry.
Editors are very visual people, but you also said that it's all about cracking the tone. And one way to crack the tone is through a great score. And before we wrap things up, I did want to talk to you about the scoring process for this. How did that come about?
His Bleeding Fingers and Russell Manuel, who organized it. We didn't have a score for a while, and the editing process was really very fast, and even though we spent a year, but it was 4 episodes in a year, and we were running out of time for a score. And actually I would always use temp, which some composers hate, and they're right to hate because we get too tied into it, but the temp was working really well. And Fisher hooked us up with these guys, Bleeding Fingers, who I had actually never heard of, and they're part of Hans Zimmer's company in LA. And the pitch was, maybe have a look at the temp, see what you think, but we don't have much time. And we were really worried about this because we thought they're not going to pull it off, and it'll be just copies of, what the temp is because they don't have the time to do it. And we sent them the cut. I never met them, and they were in LA working, and I was still editing, and we sent them episode 1. And it was like a miracle. It was the closest thing I've ever been to a miracle. The next 2-3 days, the guy started sending music back they'd be up all night. They'd be working the whole night. I think there was 3 or 4 musicians, and they would start sending music. And I'll say it again, I'm kind of obsessive about the music. And it's rare I hear the first track, and I was like, this is working. Not only is this working, this is much better than the temp. And we were using big temp, big scores, and they just went for it. And actually, the truth is, there's not much for me to say other than they nailed it straight away and got there within the time that we had. And it's a big, big part of the series. Film can really live and die on a score, and I think people don't appreciate that as much, and especially in documentary, the composers don't get that much credit because we don't have like John Williams or Hans Zimmer's or Thomas Newman's in documentaries. They're not famous, and they're like editors. They kind of work in the shadows, and these guys really did kind of work tirelessly. And what they did, I think, which was clever, is they went even bigger. They took the temp and they went even bigger, and so just go for it. And it had to compete. The score had to compete with a lot of needle drops, which is a hard thing to do, and they just got it. They just got it right.
He knows what he's doing, that Russell. I'll say that.
Oh, he's amazing. Yeah, I have to say, I really have to say, he's incredible.
So are you, and so is everybody on this project because it turned out amazing.
Thank you.
One thing that I'm taking away with me is the parallel between you and David, the obsessive nature, the attention to detail. My favorite thing about the series, other than your name being at the beginning, is that it opens with David doing some beekeeping, and the man has a monogrammed beekeeper's suit, which is just so on brand for David Beckham.
So
what's the best swag you ever got from a project? I'm assuming you didn't get a monogrammed beekeeper suit from this one.
No, but I'd love one. I would love one. I forgot about that. It's so good. The beekeeper, the outfit that he's wearing as he's walking to the bee. I forgot about that. The best swag I got was, I'm wearing it now. It's a replica. I don't even know if it's a replica, but it's the watch that Marty McFly wore on Back to the Future. I have it. It's a Casio from 1985. So at the end of the project, they got it for me on still. And it's the exact same watch as Marty McFly wore on Back to the Future. And I love it, but I can see when I'm walking around and people look at me and they're, what are you, 12 years old? And I'll be at a party and I'll shake someone's hand and like everyone. I mean, I was at dinner with Beckham and he was wearing this incredible watch and I'm wearing this Casio from 1985. And then him and Fisher were talking about watches and I just kind of covered it up with my sleeve, and so I'll leave it at that. But I love it.
Don't you ever be ashamed of that Marty McFly watch. As far as I'm concerned, you just won.
Exactly.
Seriously, if I had a souvenir Marty McFly Casio calculator watch, I would not be shy about waving that in Mr. Beckham's face. His diamond-encrusted, limited edition Tag Heuer-wearing face. There are just some things money can't buy. I do hope you enjoyed our talk with Michael, and maybe you learned a thing or two, or 3 or 4. I sure did. Thank you, Michael Harte. Get home safe to Ireland so we can chat again sometime. Okay, I gotta run, gotta cut this short. That will do it for today's show. I have to head out in search of our next guest, or guests. Who will it be? Well, we'll see. The best way for you to find out is to come back again, and I certainly hope you do. Until then, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.